Hi, and thank you for having me here. I'm Karan Khemka, and I'm with the Parthenon Group. We were recently acquired by EY, but we're keeping our name for now at least. For those of you who, just as a quick health warning, I was meant to start at 1 o'clock, and since we're starting a bit late and I need to catch a flight, I'm going to keep my comments quite brief and then leave some time for Q&A, but I'll have to dash in order to make my 5:10, so my apologies. But I'll do my best to inform and entertain in the time that we have. Very briefly on who we are, the Parthenon Group is the largest advisor to the education sector in the world, so we're sort of classic management consultants. All the countries in blue in the map in the background are ones where we have completed on-the-ground education sector projects in the last 12 to 18 months. And what you're seeing is a whole bunch of mainly higher education logos, but we do work across K12, pre-K, vocational, pretty much every sector that you can think of in education. And I mention this not only because you probably haven't heard of us before, because we're a very small company, but also so that you have some background to the context in which I will make the comments that we now will get into. So what I'd like to do to start with is, first off, I do want to thank Mr. Boots for his excellent comments and make one quick point, which is I think his project is more feasible than he thinks, because the largest online schooling company in the world, which is a New York Stock Exchange listed company called K12 Inc., was founded on the back of serving American children who were displaced from the United States. So kids living in army bases, kids living in American government outposts around the world. And it also is a sort of PPP in that it lives off the American voucher schools, or the American school vouchers you get if you are a member of the military or a member of the Foreign Service. And K12 Inc. expanded from there. So I do want to leave you with that concept, which is if you are going to build this OFW concept out further, there are a few lessons to take from K12 Inc. And I think that you've adapted it brilliantly to the situation at hand. But if you would like, I could make an introduction to K12 Inc. and they may even take on your project as a CSR initiative. And they're a very good company in that regard. But switching to the comments on this presentation, I'd like to bring us back to why it is we're talking about education. The reason why we're talking about education is because it is the most transformative ingredient to an economy, a society, a family, or an individual. It is very likely that your education is the largest investment that you have made in yourself or your family has made in you. What you are looking at on this chart, on the y-axis, is something called the tertiary enrollment ratio. It is the percent of 18 to 24-year-olds in a country that are enrolled in some form of tertiary education. On the x-axis, you are looking at the wealth of that country, so the GDP per capita, effectively. And what you can see, and this is despite the fact that this is self-reported data, this is despite the fact that Mongolia and Peru and Switzerland do not count the number the same way. This includes the OPEC countries, which of course have an income disproportionate to the level of skills of their population. Even with all of this, this one variable explains 70% of why some countries are wealthier and enjoy better standards of living than others. You will not see this relationship if you use total foreign direct investment, total investment. You will not see this relationship using any other single independent variable. So in other words, what this chart is telling us is something that you know intuitively, whether or not you've spent a day working in education before, which is education is the stuff of life. It is the most transformative ingredient in the world economy, and as we move into a service economy, you just can't get enough of it because it is the basis of labor productivity. Now, there are a few other points on this chart that are worth noting, which is as you look at emerging markets towards the bottom left, this relationship is even tighter than it is when you go to developed countries, where you can begin to make more social decisions on whether or not to enroll the next child into higher ed. Whereas in emerging markets, there really is no decision. You should enroll as many kids as you possibly can into some form of tertiary education. You shouldn't let one go. And so The reason why I bring up this chart is what we're doing here and what the ADB is doing by hosting this conference is addressing what we think is a massive ingredient in global growth, especially as increasingly Asian countries begin to touch middle income. Their next stage of growth is not going to come from just providing electricity to the country or making sure people know how to use toilet paper for hygiene. It's education. This is what will drive these countries forward or not. Now let me bring out another fact. So let's begin to peel the onion a bit, which is if we take higher education for a moment, there are 110 million students in the world in some form of tertiary education, be it in bachelors or certificates or TVET. This number has grown from 80 million 6 years ago to 110 million. That growth of 30 million, 28 million of those seats of enrollment have been driven by private investment. Only 2 have been driven by public sector investment or government. So in other words, 28 out of 30 new seats in higher ed are run and financed by the private sector. In other words, this very stuff of life, this transformation of economies in the world as we know it, what is it being driven by? We are going from a paradigm where education was absolutely not just a social good, but it was provided by the state, to education as a paradigm where it is a social good, but it doesn't matter who provides it as long as somebody's doing it and someone's doing it right. And I'd like to build on that. What you're looking at in this chart is the number of investments that have happened in emerging markets education since 1998, and we've gathered the data in 2-year clusters, so we will update it for 2014 this year. And you can see that the number of investments is increasing rapidly. When you look at this in dollar amounts, and we've been tracking the data since 1985, you will see that the number of the dollars invested in education, even inflation adjusted, in just the last 3 years is greater than all prior years from 1985 combined. In other words, we are absolutely going into a paradigm shift. And what I recently learned from the ADB today is that even the ADB is considering doubling or trebling its allocation to education. It's all part of a realization or a shift that's happening now, in real time, that this sector is not one to be neglected. The irony of this sector is that till today, till this realization has come about, the education sector has been one without a learning curve. In other words, every incremental dollar spent on education has not resulted in inefficiency. It's not resulted in efficiency, it's resulted in inefficiency. The cost of producing a graduate of a school or a college, inflation adjusted, has actually gone up instead of down. So there are tremendous challenges facing the sector, even as capital continues to pour into the sector. An objection that typically pops up with someone in the room at this point is, shucks, does that mean people are making money on education? Well, let's go to good old Harvard University as a case study. It's a $30 billion tax-free mutual fund with a college attached to the side. What's the difference between a for-profit and a not-for-profit if we take Harvard as an example? The difference is Harvard doesn't pay taxes. They probably should. So I'm happy to drill into this and debate it with you, but as long as it is accountable for outcomes, it doesn't matter in my mind and for our practice whether it is for-profit or not-for-profit. And what we will now show you is that parents are voting with their feet. What you are seeing is the growth rate of school enrollment in China, Singapore, Saudi, UAE, Oman, and Brazil of private schools. But now look at the growth rate in public schools. They're shrinking. Now, these are off different bases. The private schools are starting on a lower enrollment base, so the growth rates look more dramatic. But in aggregate numbers, the numbers don't lie. Less kids are going to public school, and more kids are going to private school. And that is a global phenomenon wherever regulations will permit it. So there are some countries like Korea where this just can't happen due to regulation. But in many countries, for example, the United Arab Emirates, which is spending incredible amounts of money on public school, this is happening. It is very real. In the UAE, and I apologize for repeating a story that I mentioned at lunch, in the UAE there was this comic moment where I was sitting with the regulator and they said, you know, we tried to build the best public school system in the world. And so what our advisors told us is that Finland has the best public school system, so we built the Finnish School of Abu Dhabi. And then I said, well, how's it working out for you? And I said, well, we're not really getting results from that. And I said, well, maybe that's because you're not in Finland. But the point is that governments around the world are really groping their way into the future, but the private sector can do things much more efficiently and elegantly in terms of providing what it is parents really want. High quality English is usually high on the list, but many of these governments are operating with their hands tied to their back because you try introducing an English or a Canadian or American teacher into the public school system of China, the UAE, or Oman, and see what happens with the local teachers' unions. They will go berserk. So let's not pretend that teachers are the messiahs and over here and the martyrs who are live for their children. No, the teachers' union in any country usually is one of the most powerful. Teachers are usually the single largest component of the workforce of any country. And so they become very powerful politically. And the way they use that power is very rarely for the benefit of students. Teacher absenteeism in India is 50% in public schools. Absenteeism of teachers. So while I don't want to make the public system entirely a pariah, what I do want to introduce is that the private system is no longer for the elite. The private system is part of a global solution. It is a megatrend. And if done responsibly, it must be supported. And that's, again, I'm going to connect this to PPP. And the way we see it is that there are a number of stakeholders that you have to please here. It's not as though you just have to fund companies and they have to generate disproportionate returns. There absolutely is a role for government as a regulator, a responsible investor. And let's not forget the parent in and of themselves is a regulator because from the private system, they can vote with their feet. They're not a victim here. They are very much empowered. And we've studied the systems across 35 different countries just recently. And what we found is that this is the sort of triangle and the tension that makes it a success or a failure, which is, number one, what you need is you do need a set of transparent and investor-friendly regulations on behalf of the government to have a flourishing private sector. You do need a good quality management system. So whether it is inspections, whether it is ratings or rankings, and you do need to think about managing either pricing or supply. Never both, because it becomes too complicated and restrictive, but you have to choose one. And where we think PPP comes in is we think that managing supply is the better route to go, rather than managing pricing. And when you manage supply, it effectively becomes a PPP because the government is saying that, look, we want you to build schools here instead of there, so we'll give you a tax break, we'll give you a better deal on land, or we'll give you the building, or we'll give you some other subsidy. So that is the nature of the partnership, and that is how it connects to our theme today. But why is supply better than pricing is the question. Because there is a school of thought that says that since a school is like a social utility, why not regulate it like you regulate the electricity company? And in most countries, the way that an electricity company or a water company would be regulated is you say, well, if it costs $100 to get the electricity to the customer, you're allowed to charge 110. Fine. But why doesn't that work in schools? The reason why that doesn't work in schools is precisely because of the disruptive nature of innovation in education. If I'm a school and I decide that I now want to bring in a flipped classroom, I now want to or I'm a low-cost school, but I can bring in native English speakers using technology, or I want to change my classroom size. These are all CapEx investments that in a price-regulated scheme I could never manage because they're lumps of cash that have to be spent but accumulated over time. And so I need to be able to free up my own pricing in order to continue to build the quality of my school. If I'm running an electricity utility and I know I need X number of megawatts, well, guess what? I crank out the megawatts and I send them out. And if my cost of materials goes up, that's fine because it's built into my cost plus. Schools don't operate that way. They do have a capital intensity and an unpredictability or a lumpiness of capital to deal with innovation. And so we think that managing supply is the right way forward. And in short, I want to leave some time for questions because I am going to have to bolt. And we had a few more slides, which are sort of a case study of why we think supply is the better route to go than pricing. A case study of how Singapore's done it and how Dubai's done it, and how Singapore's managed supply and how Dubai's managed pricing, and how we think that the pricing management has been much more problematic. And actually the role of rankings, the way that you can use rankings, and I'll email this presentation out, how you can email rankings or use rankings as a way of introducing a regulator into the system that wasn't there before. I'll email the slides, so don't bother trying to read them. But in short, we do believe that PPP in education is going to play a big role, because our underlying hypothesis from the 180 projects we do each year across 40 countries is that the private sector is giving the government a run for its money, and that's a good thing every which way. Whether it causes the government to reform or whether it results in the private sector eventually being the mass provider, it's a great outcome and nobody loses. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'll take a few questions before I have to bolt. No one disagrees with anything? That's great, because that's a first.
Department of Education, and we are thinking of a voucher program for senior high school. We already have an education service contracting scheme for junior high school at present. And just wanted to ask, clarify what you said about pricing. Obviously, from the public sector side, we have to manage pricing. We cannot have an open price and tell me what your price is and I'm going to pay that to you. But the design of the voucher program is that we will set the price or the amount of the voucher. We can vary it a bit depending on the area where the school is, a little bit probably based on income background of the student, but we will not limit all top-ups, at least for now. That is the current design, that the schools are still free to charge whatever they think their particular target market would be able to pay with the support of the voucher subsidy given by government. So is that something that is consistent with your not managing pricing approach, or are we by setting this amount? I'm asking this question because this is obviously a big area of discussion between us and private schools, some of whom are represented here.
Yes.
So just wanted to get your views on that.
I'm so glad you have asked this question. In fact, I was discussing this with the ADB just recently. We believe that there are a number of voucher systems, proven systems out there that you may consider for the Philippines. In particular, there is, and in particular, there is a scheme in Chile that we think marries perfectly what you are trying to achieve here and bringing the quality in from the private sector. So the kind of voucher that you have described right now is what we would call a straight voucher. So in other words, you are a school in Manila, or pick a neighborhood in Makati or wherever, and here you go, take $100, whatever the number is, $500, $1,000, doesn't matter. Pick a number, fine. And you are a school out in Cebu, you get less money or more money or whatever it is. That's called a straight voucher. Chile has, for many years, run a scheme that has been incredibly successful that we call a sliding voucher. Now, in the straight voucher, what you will encounter is two stresses. One stress that you will always worry about is the school spending my money? They're taking $500. Are they really spending $500 on that kid? That's stress number one. The second stress that you will worry about is, are the schools of good quality, the ones that are joining my system? And do I have to vet them? What the Chilean system does is it kind of gets rid of that with the sliding voucher because it creates a self-regulating competing system. So what the Chilean system does is, and I'm simplifying the numbers here for you, what it does is it says, look, you are a school that used to charge $10,000 to a kid. At $10,000, we will offer you no subsidy. But if you start to charge, I'm simplifying the numbers, if you now charge $9,000 to my voucher kid, we'll give you a voucher of $4,000. But if you charge $8,000, we'll give you a voucher of $7,000. And if you're willing to charge $7,800, we'll match the price entirely. In other words, what it does is it tells the school that if you take one step, we'll take two. And what that does is it creates a system that benefits the parent and you and the student. Why does it benefit the parent? Because the parent may be willing to pay a slight top-up to get a much better school. And this allows them to do that. It doesn't say it's either 500 or 10,000. It's actually saying, you know what, we can get a school that used to be really expensive to reach quite far down for you, but you will have to pay only a very slight top-up to meet the number. So the parents are able to access schools that otherwise would not participate in your voucher system if it was a straight voucher. Why is it good for you? It's good for you because as the regulator, you know that the school is spending all your money, because it's a school that charges to its non-voucher students much more than how much you're giving in the voucher. And you almost don't need to worry about quality, because these are schools that are existing at price points for the non-voucher students that are many times a multiple to what you are willing to pay in the voucher. So you almost take the inspections and the qualification, you almost throw it out of the door, because these are schools that are obviously above the mark, because parents are paying out of their pocket many times the voucher. And why is it good for the school? Now your question would be, but why would the school do this? Because if I have a classroom with 24 kids, the 25th kid is pure profit. There's no incremental cost. So if I take the 25th kid at 1/3 the tuition fee of what I got my non-voucher kids, it's fine. The kid is pure profit for me. It doesn't matter. Everybody wins in the system. And so I would be very pleased if you are interested to come back to Manila and present to you and your department how the Chilean system works, and even some other systems around the world for your consideration. It is very tempting to implement a straight voucher, because when you are starting on this journey, you will think it is the simplest system, because it's just $500 is $500. It'll turn out to be much more complicated, because your auditing of schools, your qualification of schools, your checking that they're spending your money, all of this will end up being much more complicated in the Chilean system, where it's practically self-regulating. You can almost, once you get your scale set up, you can almost shut your eyes and forget about it. Yep.
Could I follow up then on Francis's question? From the government's point of view, that might be great in terms of all the things you talked about, but does Chile fund it from the national budget? And if they do, how do you determine how much do you ask for from the national budget on an annual basis if it's a sliding scale?
Well, you see, that's a fundamental question of how much you have to spend. Now, the whole issue is if you have, just making up numbers, none of it means anything. If you've got $100 million or $300 million, you can design a very different scale, and the only difference is what caliber of school you can pull into your system. So for argument's sake, let's say I have a $100 million budget. What will happen is the scale I will create will be one where I can only be attractive to schools up to a certain price point in the free market. But with a $300 million budget, I could push my scale up to attract schools that are at a much higher price point in the free market. So that question is actually just a piece of arithmetic, which is in turn a function of your annual voucher budget. And it is pure arithmetic. Anything else?
Thank you. I'm an applied researcher on the practice of sustainability. Going by your presentation earlier, you mentioned there is a transformation paradigm shift, and there is a huge growth of private sector schools. So considering the developing country context, there is a huge trend that students do take loans from banks to do their education. Now, I'm just extrapolating this. Is these private sector funded colleges and schools are willing to sign a contract with the student assuring them a job after they complete to a certain level of performance, which means that it's not the duty of the output of the school is not only giving them the certificate, but the whole idea of a good school is not only the education, but a future.
So student loans are 99.9% in higher education as opposed to primary or secondary, because if you're funding a kid through primary school, you've got to wait a long, long time before they hit the job market. So your loan gets a little bit expensive and a little bit dicey. So it's mostly for higher ed. That said, it's a fair question for higher ed. The challenge with guaranteeing a job is most of the time student loans are not private loans. They're not purely private. There's usually some government subsidy in the loan. And most of the time, one of the conditions of that subsidy is that the institutions that are benefiting from the loan should not make unfair representations to students. Those of you who are Americans in this audience or who have lived in America recently will know that President Obama is actually at war with the private university and school industry or college industry in the United States on something called graduate employability. And this whole war started because one of the private colleges owned by a very large company called Kaplan was caught by a reporter on audio tape making a promise to a student that if you come to my college, I guarantee you'll get a job. And what happens is once the job guarantee comes into the equation, it becomes a bit of a racket as long as the student loan scheme has some government support or subsidy built in. So there is a political sensitivity around the guarantee a job component of it. It would be great if universities could provide that guarantee to students who did take a loan or even didn't take a loan. And some MBA programs that are living off purely private loans, so these would be loans, let's say, provided by Citibank on a completely commercial basis, they more or less are taking a bet on the students. So if you take Harvard Business School or Wharton, they're saying that Citibank or HSBC will fully fund you on a private loan basis. And together, Citibank and the school are taking a punt that I know this kid will be good for it. But those kinds of programs are usually for such an elite class of schools, right? We're talking about Wharton or HBS. We're not even talking about Harvard College for undergraduate, that they're not truly scalable. So it is a good aspiration for higher education, but there is a political sensitivity, which is the racket that comes into guaranteeing jobs and the subsidized loan and the dynamic between the two. And then there's a question of how realistic it is for the mass market of private higher education. I mean, a lot of us here in this audience will have gone to very good universities. But what we don't realize is that higher education has become a true mass market product. In the United States, there are 16 million students in some form of tertiary education, but the entire Ivy League is 121,000 students of enrollment. So in other words, the world that we come from and the ability that our universities that we went to had to get us jobs, the way that whole system worked, it's as though we've only driven Ferraris and Rolls Royces our whole life, and we're now sitting in this room talking to people about what kind of Toyota they want. It's a complete detachment from what's actually happening out there. Thank you for your time. I hope that was useful. Thank you.